in poor Muslim majority nations through aid, remittances, investment, and religious funding. And most importantly, what sort of social consequences these countries have had to face. In this chart, you could see the Saudi oil export revenues, which were termed oil rents, how they increased in terms of share of GDP from 1970 to 1980. Pakistan, for example, throughout 1980s, thousands of madrasas funding were done during Afghan jihad. Morocco are promoting Maliki Sufism in schools now to counter Wahhabi ideas. A bit of a history lesson first into the rise of petrodollar. This channel has thus far been dedicated to making educational and history content in Urdu, since this was the original intent. But since the topic today has a bit of a global outreach and consequences, I decided to do this in English. We're doing the same for similar topics in future as well. So today we are analyzing Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia's petro wealth in particular has influenced development, religion, politics in poor Muslim majority nations through aid, remittances, investment, and religious funding. And most importantly, what sort of social consequences these countries have had to face. I've personally seen this materialize in the context of Pakistan first, and then through my travels in various Muslim countries around the world. So let's start with a bit of a history lesson first into the rise of petrodollar. And if you go back to 1973, the year 1973, that's where the world particularly changed. Following the oil embargo, Saudi Arabia's revenues exploded from $1 billion in 1970 to over $100 billion by 1980. That's when the term petrodollar was coined, which was referring to the fact that to the US dollars earned through oil exports. And in this chart, you could see the Saudi oil export revenues, which were termed oil rents, how they increased in terms of share of GDP from 1970 to 1980. You can clearly see that it was below 30% of the total GDP in 1970 and to over 70% in 1980s. So with this newfound wealth, Saudi Arabia began exporting more than just oil. It exported ideology, Wahhabism specifically, and a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam. And we'll go in later on in the video why it was done and how it was done and what effects did it have. First, let's just dive into exporting Wahhabism and the strategy behind it. What was the strategy? If you look specifically between 1975 and 2000, Saudi Arabia spent an estimated $75 to $100 billion promoting Wahhabism abroad. This included funding over 1,500 mosques, 2,000 schools, and several Islamic universities. And the sources of this information and the stats I will put in the description of video for you to analyze yourselves. So with this over $100 billion spent on global Wahhabi propagation, you could see the examples of this and the consequences of this in various Muslim countries around the world. I'll just take a few examples. In Pakistan, for example, throughout 1980s, thousands of madrasas funding were done during Afghan jihad, and it had consequences throughout following decade, and we're probably still facing that in the case of Pakistan. In Bangladesh, over 560 Islamic schools were established by Saudi charities. In case of Indonesia, Lipia University curriculum was based on Wahhabi doctrine, and the graduates were often becoming clerics, preachers, and teachers. So it was just the strategy, and the goal was through religious funding, counter Iran's post-1979 Shia influence, and this established some sort of Saudi leadership of the Sunni world. These were the goals and the strategy behind it. Now let's look into whether Saudi religious aid was indeed charity or a means of control. In poor nations where education and welfare systems were weak, Saudi aid filled the vacuum, but it often came with some strings attached. If we look into the case study of Niger, where over 40% of the population still lives in poverty, Saudi-funded clerics began replacing traditional Sufi Islam with Wahhabi teachings, music was banned, women were urged to veil fully, social cohesion was fractured. There's a quote from one of Niger's sociologists, and he says that we didn't realize until later that we had imported a new way of life, one that didn't belong here. If you take the example or a case study of Bosnia, after the Yugoslav wars, Saudi NGOs arrived with reconstruction funds, but with them came literature, teachings that condemn local Islamic traditions as bid'ah, as innovation, and then the impact of that was a century-old way of life. Old tolerant Islam of Balkans, for example, faced huge pressure from a strict foreign interpretation of Islam. Now, all these case studies that I've mentioned, examples that I've mentioned, be it Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bosnia, Niger, Indonesia. All of these case studies, all of these societies had big pressure and they had impact on their local tradition and society. I will try to analyze the three major impacts in the society. First of it is educational reform or indoctrination. In many Saudi-funded madrasas, Quranic memorization often replaced critical thinking. And I can vouch personally in the case of Pakistan that this happened, how much it was regarded and is still regarded. So subjects like science, history and philosophy were marginalized. They're still marginalized in huge chunks of the population. And the impact of that was a generation grew up which were taught that the true Islam came from Riyadh, not their homeland. In the case of Pakistan, there is 20,000 plus madrasas still operate with curricula which is influenced by Wahhabi scholars. The second impact that I would like to highlight is women's rights and gender segregation. If you take the example of places like Somalia and northern Nigeria, Saudi-inspired clerics push for strict gender norms, full veiling, male guardianship, bans on female employment. These ideas conflicted with pre-existing customs where women were more visible in society. And lastly, we can talk about how it fueled extremism. Though Saudi Arabia officially condemns terrorism, critics argue that Wahhabi ideology itself emphasized exclusivism and apostasy, so which has indirectly fostered extremism. If you look at some stats, 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudi citizens. Between 1990 and 2010, over 500 militants in Afghanistan and Iraq had studied in Saudi-funded institutions. So the link is indirect because Saudi Arabia doesn't like to be directly involved. This is their strategy behind it. But the link is very much real. Saudi funding created a fertile ground where violent ideologies could flourish. So if you look at some global reactions, pushback and shifting tide in the end, there are things which are happening around the world in these Muslim countries which are pushing back, which are realizing this influence and this shifting in their local traditions. And now they are trying to make a tide or a wave, you can call it, which is trying to make a difference. In Indonesia, for example, in 2019, the government restricted Libya's activities, the university that I mentioned earlier, after huge backlash over rising intolerance. In the case of Morocco, where I was recently, and I saw and I talked to people about their, let's say, pushback and a contempt of the Saudi culture. They in Morocco are promoting Maliki Sufism in schools now to counter Wahhabi ideas. Women themselves are pushing back. In Nigeria, for example, groups like Muslim Sisters for Peace are campaigning against imported gender laws that marginalize women. And I know in context of Pakistan, these changes are also happening slowly but surely. So there's a bit of a shifting tide. And ironically, while Saudi Arabia now modernizes under this new vision of 2030, which is supposed to allow cinema, reduces religious policing, and is thought to have promoting women employment. Its legacy abroad, this is what is the topic of today's discussion, remains deeply conservative. There's a quote from Dr. Madawi al-Rashid saying that Saudis are liberalizing at home, but have left behind a hardened, intolerant version of Islam across the Muslim world. So to conclude, Saudi petrodollars didn't just build mosques. They reshaped global Islam in more ways than one. For many poor Muslim countries, this was more than just a charity. It was religious identity, cultural influence, and geopolitical power. From Senegal to Indonesia, if you look at various examples, and a few of them I mentioned in this video today, a new standardized Islam spread. But now, there is hope. There's a bit of quiet revival underway, but the question still remains. Will Muslim nations reclaim their spiritual autonomy or continue to pray in the shadow of petrodollar? Thank you.